A deadly lie hiding in plain sight. In every town, on every street, at every hour of the night, tiny moments happen that mean nothing to most people. A group of friends walking home, a stranger leaning on a lamppost, a scooter left against a wall. Small moments. Forgettable moments. Moments no one pays attention to. But sometimes those tiny moments collide with someone dangerous, someone unpredictable, someone with a past nobody around them knows about. Someone who looks like just another face in the crowd, but carries an entire history of violence behind their eyes. This is the story of one of those collisions. It happened in Bournemouth, a seaside town known for nightlife, beaches, students, families, not for the kind of violence that would make national headlines. Yet in the early hours of one ordinary night, an argument broke out over something almost laughably small. An e-scooter. A stupid, petty disagreement, the kind you'd expect to end in rolled eyes and annoyed words. But instead, it ended with a 21-year-old young man, Thomas Roberts, bleeding out on the pavement. A lad with a future, a lad with ambition, a lad who was trying to do the right thing. And the man holding the knife, the man responsible for killing him, was not who he claimed to be. He wasn't 14. He wasn't a harmless asylum-seeking child. He wasn't even the person the papers first believed him to be. He was Lawangeen Abdulrahimzai, an Afghan who arrived in the UK under a false identity, a man who had already murdered 2 people with a rifle in Serbia before stepping foot on British soil, a man who lied about his age, a man who fooled the system, a man who had run from one set of killings just to commit another. This is the story of how a young man with dreams of joining the Royal Marines was stabbed to death trying to be a peacemaker, and how his killer slipped through every crack in the system, leaving devastation behind him in multiple countries. This is the real story of the e-scooter murder and the killer who had murdered before. Who was Thomas Roberts? Before we talk about the darkness of that night, we need to understand the light that came before it, because Thomas Roberts wasn't just another victim. He was a son, a brother, a friend, and a young man with a future he was working hard to build. Thomas grew up in Bournemouth, a coastal town that's bright in the day, loud at night, and home to thousands of young adults building their lives. He worked as a precision engineer, a skilled job, a job that takes patience, focus, and dedication. And he had bigger plans. Thomas wanted to join the Royal Marines. He had been training, preparing, and pushing himself physically. It wasn't some random dream. It was a goal he was actively working towards. Friends described him as disciplined, polite, calm, and always willing to step in when someone needed help. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't confrontational. He wasn't violent. He was the opposite, a lad who tried to de-escalate things, not escalate them. And on the night he died, that part of his personality, the part that made him step forward and try to calm a situation, would put him directly in harm's way. He wasn't out looking for trouble. He wasn't even involved in the stupid argument that triggered everything. He was simply trying to help. A young man with dreams, a young man with discipline, a young man with a future that would be stolen in seconds. Who was Lawangeen Abdulrahimzai? To understand the danger Thomas unknowingly walked into, we need to look at the man who took his life. When he first arrived in the UK, Lawangeen Abdulrahimzai presented himself as a vulnerable 14-year-old refugee, a child escaping war, a child in need of safety, a child alone in a foreign country. But none of that was true. He wasn't 14, he wasn't harmless, he wasn't running from violence, he had committed violence. Just a few years earlier, in Serbia, Abdulrahimzai had been involved in a brutal shooting that left 2 men dead. He was convicted in his absence, meaning he fled the country before he could be arrested. He crossed borders. He lied repeatedly about his age. He changed his story depending on who he was talking to. And eventually, he reached the UK, a country that believed his story, placed him with foster carers, and treated him as a child in need of protection. Nobody knew he had already killed. Nobody knew he was older than he claimed. Nobody knew he had a history of violence that stretched across Europe. He blended in. He acted quiet. He acted troubled. He acted young. But behind closed doors, signs of aggression began to emerge. He carried knives. He threatened people. He posted videos online mimicking armed fighters. He talked about war. He argued. He lashed out. And he had a habit of acting like the rules didn't apply to him. The truth was simple. Abdulrahimzai was a dangerous man in disguise. And on the night Thomas Roberts crossed paths with him, that danger would explode into violence. The night of the killing. It was after 3 a.m. Bournemouth's nightlife was winding down. The clubs were emptying. Streets were scattered with people waiting for taxis, kebabs, lifts home. Thomas and his friend James were walking along Old Christchurch Road, a busy nightlife strip. Up ahead was a row between 2 other men, one of them being Abdulrahimzai. The argument? A stupid, meaningless dispute over an e-scooter. The scooter didn't belong to Abdulrahimzai, but he had taken it and claimed it as his. When the real owner, or someone connected to the owner, challenged him, tempers flared, shouting, pushing, threats. The typical late-night nonsense you see outside bars every weekend. Thomas wasn't involved. He wasn't even part of the argument. But he saw things escalating, saw someone getting worked up, and stepped in to calm things down. He was trying to be the peacemaker. James, his friend, also stepped forward. Both of them were calm. Both of them were sober enough to know things were getting stupid. Neither of them were threatening, but one person in that situation wasn't calm, and he wasn't looking for peace. Inside Abdulrahimzai, something snapped. The confrontation turns deadly. Witnesses later said the confrontation didn't last long. There wasn't a brawl. There wasn't a long fight. There wasn't time for anyone to realize how quickly things were going wrong. Thomas stepped between the two groups, putting himself between the argument and the chance things could escalate. And in that split second, Abdulrahimzai reached down, pulled out a knife he had been hiding, and lunged forward. 2 rapid stabbing motions, fast, controlled, deliberate. The blade went deep, into the chest, into vital organs. Thomas staggered back, confused, shocked, not understanding the severity of what had just happened. Within seconds, his shirt was soaked in blood. He collapsed onto the pavement. What makes this moment even more tragic is how quick it was. He didn't have time to defend himself. He didn't have time to react. He didn't even know the man who killed him. And for what? A scooter argument he wasn't even a part of. Abdulrahimzai ran, disappeared into the night, left Thomas dying behind him. People called for help. They applied pressure. They tried to keep him awake. Paramedics arrived quickly, but the wounds were too severe. Thomas was taken to hospital, but he didn't survive. 21 years old, a future gone in seconds. The immediate aftermath. While Thomas's family was being notified, the police were scrambling. A stabbing in a nightlife district, witnesses describing a chaotic situation, a suspect who had vanished before anyone knew what happened. But Abdulrahimzai made mistakes. There were security cameras, there were witnesses, there was CCTV from shops, clubs, and bus stops. Within hours, detectives had a timeline. Within a day, they had a suspect. Within 48 hours, they had a name, Lawangeen Abdulrahimzai. But the name didn't tell the full story, not yet. What police didn't know was that this man, this supposed child refugee, had an entire criminal history in another country. That would come later. For now, they needed to find him, and it didn't take long. He was arrested in Bournemouth shortly after the stabbing.
An individual in Old Christchurch Road, Bournemouth, was stabbed and subsequently died. Inquiries have established that you have been responsible and therefore you're arrested on suspicion of murder.
But when they brought him in, when they started to dig into who he really was, the truth began to unravel. The killer's hidden life in the UK. When Abdulrahimzai came to the UK, he had played the system like a violin. He claimed he was 14. He claimed he was a child with no family. He claimed he was fleeing war. Social services placed him with foster carers, a couple who treated him with kindness, patience, and compassion. He lived in a peaceful environment. He was given support. He was treated as a vulnerable minor. But even in that home, signs of aggression appeared. He carried knives. He hid weapons. He uploaded videos acting like a fighter with rifles. He argued with people his age. He fought in the streets. He had outbursts. He told multiple conflicting stories about his past, none of which fully lined up. But the most dangerous part, he had convinced everyone he was a child when he was actually several years older. He looked older, he acted older, he was older, and his true past wasn't just complicated, it was deadly, because years before the night he stabbed Thomas Roberts, he had already taken 2 lives. The earlier murders in Serbia. This is the part of the story that stunned everyone when it came out in court. Before he ever set foot in the UK, before he ever claimed asylum, before he ever pretended to be a child, Lawangeen Abdulrahimzai had already murdered 2 people. It happened in Serbia, during a dispute involving human smuggling routes and border crossings. According to court documents, Abdulrahimzai fired a Kalashnikov-style rifle at 2 men, killing both. He fled the country before he could be arrested. He crossed borders, travelled through asylum systems, and eventually made his way to Britain. Serbia tried him in his absence. He was convicted without ever being present in court. He was a convicted double murderer, and yet the UK believed he was a vulnerable 14-year-old with no criminal past. No one checked, no one found the truth, no one linked his fingerprints, no one flagged his name, so he lived freely, he moved around, he carried knives, and eventually he killed again. The murder trial. When the case reached court, the public finally heard the full story. They heard about the e-scooter argument, they heard about the stabbing, they heard about Thomas's final moments, and then they heard about Abdulrahimzai's past. A past that shocked the UK. Jurors listened to evidence about the double murder in Serbia. They learned he had lied about his age. They learned he had masked his identity. They learned he had hidden violent tendencies for years. They saw CCTV of him fleeing after the stabbing. They saw footage of him carrying knives in public months earlier. They saw social media videos of him posing with weapons. His defense tried to argue that he acted out of fear, that he was traumatized, that he didn't know what he was doing, but the jury didn't buy it. This wasn't fear, this wasn't confusion, this was deliberate, targeted violence. They found him guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 29 years before parole. And Thomas's family, the family of a young man who had everything ahead of him, were left to live with a loss that should have never happened. The system that failed. This case wasn't just about a stabbing. It wasn't just about an argument. It wasn't just about youth violence. It was about something bigger. A man who had killed before was able to enter the UK, lie about his age, lie about his identity, avoid background checks, receive protection, live freely, and kill again. The system didn't catch him. It didn't flag him. It didn't stop him. Thomas Roberts should still be alive. He wasn't killed by chance. He was killed because a dangerous man successfully hid who he really was, and that failure cost a young man his life. The legacy of the case. Today, Thomas's story is a reminder of the fragility of life, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, a reminder of how strangers can bring hidden dangers with them. It sparked conversations about asylum checks, age verification, criminal background sharing between countries, late-night violence, knife crime, and the safety of young men on British streets. Thomas wasn't involved in crime. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't the aggressor. He was the peacemaker, and he paid the ultimate price. Conclusion: a life lost, a warning left behind, a dispute over an e-scooter, a confrontation that lasted seconds, a knife that should never have been carried, a killer who should never have been here, and a young man whose future, his career, his dreams, his relationships, his entire life was stolen. This is the story of the e-scooter murder, the story of Thomas Roberts, and the story of a killer who had already taken lives before he ever reached Britain. A reminder that behind every face on the street, behind every argument that seems small, behind every moment that seems meaningless, there can be an entire hidden history, and sometimes that history is deadly.